gone. Our baklava shells crumble and they crack when too many outside forces just crush in and push in on us. Now, every one of us has a closet full of different hats. And from time to time, we put on a different hat that is appropriate for the situation that we find ourselves in. There are so many challenges, so many responsibilities, but to hold it all together, to hold ourselves all together, we depend on inner support, a central, unending ramrod, rebar of strength and stability. And it's that support that holds us, and it keeps us going, and it keeps us straight. It's that support that is our real self, not our posing, not the posturing that sometimes we do, but it keeps us stronger than the poses that we present. So today, Isaiah, the prophet, reveals these two basic elements that make up my inner core and your inner core, and the essential character of all of those, everyone who has received the redeeming grace of God in their lives. And those two essential things are righteousness and justice. Mishpat, Tzedakah, that's the spiritual rebar that runs through the center of our soul. All of us who are in this grace-filled relationship with God. So when we have this unshakable interior, the exterior can be remarkably varied. Look around, however many folks of us, we are each one individuals. John Johnson is John Johnson. He's not John Bennett. Deborah is not George, and George is not Deborah. We're all our own people. And we have all experienced God's grace. And when we have this spiritual interior, Isaiah says we can either be a eunuch, which doesn't get much respect, or we can be a patriarch, we can be a foreigner, or we can be an Israelite. You see what he's saying here? And nobody has to worry about striking a faked up pose as long as their interior guide of Mishpat, justice, Tzedakah, righteousness, remain straight and remain unshaken at the very core of our and your being. John Bennett may know who John Moriarty is. John Moriarty was an Irish scholar. He was of the Celtic spirituality and folklore. And you're going to have to hang on to this, because when I found it, I had to read it 3 times before I thought how good it was. And Moriarty tells a parable that's found in various forms in almost every culture there is. But in the Celtic version of this, a collector of shellfish finds himself marooned one night out on a rock in the ocean. And when the tide came roaring in, dolphins gathered at that rock in the darkness. And because it was dark and no one could see, they shed their skins. And they revealed themselves as beautiful, magnificent human beings. But before dawn, they all returned to the sea. However, that shell collector, hiding there in the darkness, had taken one of the skins that they shed. And that one skin belonged to a woman, and she didn't have her skin anymore, so she couldn't be her dolphin self. All of the dolphins left, but the man and that one woman. And those two became friends, and she followed him home, and eventually they got married. Well, all goes normally, all goes on, until one day she's standing in the kitchen, making bread. And all of a sudden, amazingly, from seemingly out of nowhere, a drop of dolphin oil drips from the ceiling onto the table where she is making bread. And she smells the aroma of that dolphin drop, and it brings her back to her real sense of herself, who she was. And so she searched and she searched and she searched, and she finally found her skin hidden in the attic of the house. And she puts it on, and she immediately becomes a dolphin lady again. And she returns to the ocean. Now, John Moriarty uses this story to remind each of us how the hints of the eternal show up to us in the midst of everyday, ordinary life. We live immersed in dailiness. You remember back right after Pentecost when I said we had these weeks of ordinary time. We find ourselves immersed in dailiness, ordinary time, but dailiness is not our final destiny. What is my true identity? What is your true identity? Where is our true home? What is our true self? How can we be faithful to the two homes that each of us have? One of them is our earthly home that we're very familiar with, but the other one is our mysterious, unknown, heavenly home, our eternal home. What are those dolphin drops in our lives that recall us to what is eternal and what is true? Think about this. What are the dolphin drops, if you will? And again, this is allegorical. It's not really dolphin drops. You know what I'm saying. What are the things that remind us of our true identity as disciples who live lives of Mishpat, who live lives of Tzedakah, lives of justice, lives of righteousness? Isaiah's text, one of the marks of faithful, righteous foreigner, is that they keep the Sabbath and do not, and I love the word profane as a verb. They do not profane it. The Sabbath is one of those shimmering, shining, bright dolphin drops that plops right down in our lap each and every week. Keeping the Sabbath doesn't mean that we have to abide by all of the behavioral structures that have been added to this day because of human layers that men want to add to what God has already created. Blue laws don't have anything to do, really, with what Sabbath means. They show what we as people wanted to add to what God had already done. Wrangling over light switches and whether they could be turned on and off during Sabbath, as our Orthodox Jewish friends do, or whether we can buy this food or this article of clothing or that article of clothing on the Sabbath, really doesn't alter the essential sanctity of Sabbath, or even a Sabbath moment. That makes and keeps the Sabbath holy, whether it's for Americans here in Memphis or for foreigners living, the Israelites, is recognizing and remaining faithful to the practice of justice, to the practice of righteousness that Sabbath, the idea, the concept of Sabbath, brings into our world. The dolphin drops of Sabbath keeping means keeping the mishpat, the tzedakah that God intended for the world. We lose sight of God's Sabbath so frequently. Not so much when we watch TV or go to a football game instead of going to church. No, we profane God's Sabbath when we don't live a life of righteousness and justice Monday through Saturday. We profane the Sabbath when on Tuesday we deal unjustly with the people that we work with. We profane the Sabbath on Thursday when we walk right by that homeless man sitting on the sidewalk and just totally ignore him. Keeping the Sabbath reveals our inner core of Mishpat and Zedekah. Profaning the Sabbath reveals our hollowed out interior. That makes us a poser. And that begs the question then, are we real Christians or are we just posing as Christians? Well, the truth is that other dolphin drops fall constantly into our lives, reminding us to look up and to take notice of who we really are and what we really stand for and who we really serve and who we are as people. None of us, not a one of us, will ever forget the nightmare morning of September the 11th, 2001. But even as these massive steel buildings fell to the ground, there arose among those local folks there in New York City interior rods of steel. While the buildings fell and the steel crumpled, the interior rods rose up, and a host of just normal, everyday working men and women rushed to save the trapped, rushed to save the injured, rushed to find the lost, rushed to help the frightened. Their souls steel on the inside. It was there when those girders were falling all around them. Now, most of us probably weren't present at that terrible scene, but I would be willing to bet most of us had almost the exact same action. Think about it if you can. Go back to that day. How many of you immediately went to your telephone and called your spouse, called your kids, called your parents, called your friends? You know, we were shaken on the outside, but what stood up on the inside was what was real for us. We were worried about those people we love. That's what was real. So, dolphin drops don't have to be dramatic to catch your attention or to remind you of what's important. Isaiah called all of God's faithful to join with the foreigner in God's house of prayer. The very notion that you and I are called to communicate with God is an everyday miracle. That's a dolphin drop. The fact that God, Jesus, invites us to his table every Sunday, that is a dolphin drop. In communion and in conversation with the divine, we must feel justice and we must feel righteousness. We must feel the love and power, the otherness, and the intimacy of God's presence. So in 5 minutes, we're going to walk out the door. Worship's over. But the Sabbath presence goes with us. Watch, listen, feel those dolphin drops when we leave here today. And when they hit, let them eat away all of our posing and let them lubricate the steel of our soul's true self. I know you people, and I know you're strong, steel people, and I'm blessed to be a part of this church. We're not posing. We are God's people. So go Let those dolphin drops lubricate your steel self, your true self, and go